Okay, so we're in the finishing stages here of the lizard here that I was working on, and in the last episode I broke off the tail and was trying to figure out what to do about fixing it, and so I chose, as you can see, to go with the extended tail as opposed to the one that looped around, and it actually took me 3 tries. I glued it on, I doweled it, and I glued it on, and I used carpenter's glue, and that didn't work, because basically I wasn't patient enough. I thought it was dry, it wasn't, and it came apart, so I had to take it off, and I re-glued it, and then again I did the same thing. I thought I left plenty of time, but I didn't. So then I ended up doing epoxy. I used a 2-part epoxy on there, and that seemed to work. I left it dry. Now the only problem is, when I shaped it, you can see it actually looks, pretty good. About as good as I could hope, grain-wise. It's obvious. It's visible, but it's a pretty good matchup. And on the bottom, look at that, it matches really well, but there's a little bit of a glue seam because I 3 times on a glue seam. And also my dowel, I sanded through to my dowel on the inside, so it kind of looks just like a little knot or defect, although the wood is pretty clear, so it doesn't really belong in there. So if I want to hide that, I can just I can paint the thing. I kind of like the grain in it, so that was the whole idea here. And I don't think you'll really notice it from a distance. If I didn't point it out, no one would really know. So anyway, I have it pretty well sanded with 80 grit paper. I still have a little bit to do on that. Now the thing with the sanding here is you basically, sanding is putting scratches in the wood. That's basically what you're doing. You have little tiny pieces of crushed abrasive material on here, and it's just putting a million little scratches in the wood, and then as you progress, you make the scratches smaller and smaller until they aren't very visible. But they're there, and the difference between that and the surface that comes from a sharp scraper or a sharp knife is completely different. So you have to be accepting of that, what that's going to look like when it's finished. Now if you're going to put something, a number of coats of something on there, like polyurethane or whatever, a lot of times that'll obscure those scratches, which is probably what I'm going to do. If I paint it, obviously that's a non-issue. But the idea with the sanding is that you want to use a grit that's abrasive enough to take off all the high spots. In other words, wherever there was a kind of a divot left by your knife or your gouge, you want to level that out so that the surface is even. So for me, on this particular wood, I find an 80 grit seemed to work pretty effectively. And what I was actually using is I think I threw them out. There it is. A sanding disc, a round sanding disc that was intended to go on a disc sander. This is a half a disc, and it's got a self-adhesive, so I folded it over so I get a 1/4 piece. And then I just keep creasing it in different places to kind of get a new edge, so that when I'm sanding in here, I get an edge. When this gets worn, I'll just fold it somewhere else, and I keep getting a new edge. Also, if I wanted to get in a place where I want to, be able to just get in without hitting the corner, I can use the round edge. So that's just an idea. But I like using this self-adhesive, folding it over on itself, and you got 2 surfaces of abrasive without it, and it's a little thicker that way, so you get a little support when you want to sand curves. So I use the 80 grit. Now once I get this all the way down, if you look here, you see right here, there's a little bit of a shadow there. I don't know if you can see that. That's a little gouge mark. Probably what I did originally with one of my round bits. The other one. Where's the other one? This one. If you remember, I was using this round bit to go along here, and that's still left over from that. So what I need to do is sand this whole area down until the lowest spot of that is the highest spot of this whole carving. So that's what you have to do. Now if I leave something like that behind, if I leave any marks, any tool marks that I didn't remove with the 80 grit, when I go to the next grit, I'm just still going to have that problem, and it's going to be harder and harder and harder to get rid of that divot with progressive grits. So the idea is to take your heaviest grit and complete sanding the entire carving, every bit of it, so that it's all at the same level of finish with that one grit, and then you're done with it. You don't come back to it. If I go from an 80 to a 120, I don't want to go back to 80, because then I'm going to be putting scratches that are more that are deeper than the ones that the 120 would leave. Now I also have 100 paper, so I could go to 100 next, or I could go to 120. And a lot of it has to do with the wood. So if you're doing a hardwood, if you're doing something like basswood, it's very different from sanding something like pine. So you have to make your adjustment on there. But the main thing is that you're basically putting an even coat, if you want to think of it that way, of scratches on this whole thing that are all nice and level and smooth, and there's no spots that are divots, little dents, grooves, anything, carving marks that didn't get leveled out with that grit of sandpaper. Then we're done with that. Once the entire piece is done to your satisfaction, then you got to go back. Then you're going to go through the whole thing again with the next grit, which I would use probably 120. If that doesn't seem to do it, then I'll maybe have to use the 100, but I don't think that's a big enough jump. I'll go to 120. Now, with this, I don't think that's going to be enough to finish it. If you're going to do an oil finish or anything like that that doesn't build a coat on the outside of this, then you really have to have your wood sanded even more, and you want to go up to at least 220, maybe even 300 grit on that. Okay, so on this, I think I'll probably do 120 and then maybe go to a 180, see what that looks like, maybe finish with 220. Okay, sorry about that phone call. Anyway, so that's the idea, and the same principle applies whether you're using hand sander or for some of this I actually used a little drum sander that I put in my drill, and I have a larger one. This is like a half-inch one, and I have a 1.5 inch one that I used to sand in the inside the tail here. Anyway, so it was an interesting project. I learned a few things, and I think in the future, if I were to do something like this with this type of grain situation, if I were to shape this with something like this, like a drum sander, or this is like a rasp, like a file type sander, I think that would have been okay. But the problem came in when I got into this guy, which is, first of all, it's not a very good quality. I think this is a steel one that I bought at a flea market somewhere. But anyway, this guy, just too aggressive, and what happens was it caught in the back half of the tail, and it just pulled the grain such that it just snapped it right off. So, and if I was carving with hand tools, I could have probably done it with a knife, but anything else, if I used any mallet or anything, I would have surely broken that anyway. So, but I think if I was using some abrasive wheels, drum sanders rather, I could have probably sanded that without breaking it, so that would have been nice. So we'll see. I had a request to do this again as a painted version with a lot of detail, so I might do that. That might be a fun project too. Okay, that's it for this project. I will post the final photo when it's all done with finish on it on the blog, but for now this is the last video I'm going to do on this.